Wallace Rhodes slammed both palms flat on the commission table so hard that the inkwells rattled, and the secretary nearly knocked over his chair scrambling backward. The room fell absolutely silent. 30 men, ranchers and lawyers and territorial officials and petty bureaucrats who had spent the last 2 hours telling Martha Wells that her land was forfeit, that her claim was invalid, that she had no legal standing and no recourse and ought to pack her belongings and be grateful she had until the end of the month. Every last one of them stared at Wallace Rhodes as though he had just walked through the wall. His jaw was set like iron. His eyes were the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard rolls in, that particular shade of gray-blue that carries nothing gentle inside it. He was 34 years old, and he had the kind of face that the frontier carves rather than merely weathers, all hard angles and deep lines, the face of a man who had survived things and chosen not to talk about them. He wore no jacket. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows despite the formality of the occasion, and the dust on his boots had not been cleaned off before he walked through the door of the Laramie County Land Commission hearing room, because he had ridden 42 miles in under 6 hours, and he had not stopped for anything except to water his horse twice. He reached into the interior pocket of his vest, and he drew out a folded document. It was wrapped in oilskin. He set it on the table in front of Commissioner Gerald Holt, and he smoothed it open with one broad hand, pressing the creases flat with deliberate, unhurried motions, while the entire room watched him and said nothing. Her grandfather filed that claim legally, Wallace said. His voice was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that is more dangerous than shouting. And I have the original. The document was dated September 14, 1868. It bore the territorial seal of Wyoming. It bore the signature of the registrar of the General Land Office and the notarized signature of one Elias Wells, who had filed under the Homestead Act of 1862 and had fulfilled every single legal requirement before he died. The claim was for 480 acres in the Sweetwater Valley. The claim was for Martha Wells's home. Commissioner Holt reached for the document with hands that were not entirely steady. He was 60 years old, and he had been taking instructions from Dalton Briggs, who sat at the far end of the room with his attorney and his silence and his flat, calculating expression for the better part of a decade. And now he sat holding a piece of paper that made everything Dalton Briggs had constructed around the forced acquisition of the Wells property fall apart like wet paper in a rainstorm. Martha Wells was sitting at the far left side of the room. She had not spoken in 40 minutes. She had stopped speaking when the commission's attorney had produced what he claimed was a counterfiling, and 3 witnesses who all swore under oath that Elias Wells had never properly registered his claim. She had gone pale and quiet, and very still in the way that a person goes still when they have been hit so hard by something that the body simply stops processing. She was 26 years old, and she had been fighting for this land for 7 months, since the spring, since the week after her grandfather died, and she had been fighting alone. She was not alone anymore. She watched Wallace Rhodes stand at that table, and her heart did something complicated that she did not yet have words for. But to understand what Wallace Rhodes was doing in that hearing room, and why the document in his vest pocket meant something that went far beyond a piece of land, you have to go back to the beginning of it. You have to go back to October, 5 months before, to the morning when Martha Wells knocked on the door of the Rhodes cattle ranch, and changed both of their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted or prepared for. The autumn of 1875 in Wyoming territory was cold and arriving early. The cottonwood trees along the Sweetwater had gone yellow, and the wind off the high country carried an edge to it that promised hard weather before long. Martha Wells had walked 3 miles that morning. She had walked because her horse had gone lame the week before, and she could not afford the blacksmith yet, not until she sold the last of the autumn hay she had cut and bundled from the upper pasture herself, working from first light to last light for 11 straight days after her grandfather's funeral. She wore a wool coat that had been her grandfather's, dark brown and too large in the shoulders, and she carried a document satchel made of cracked leather that had also been his. She had heard about Wallace Rhodes from her grandfather. Elias Wells had spoken of the man with a kind of cautious respect, the way he spoke of weather systems and difficult terrain and other forces that were neither enemies nor friends, but demanded honest acknowledgement. Wallace Rhodes ran 1,200 acres of cattle range north of the Sweetwater. He had bought out 3 smaller operations in the past 4 years and built them into something serious. He had a reputation for being fair in business dealings and brutal in disputes. He had also, according to Elias Wells, once turned away a land agent from Dalton Briggs's operation at gunpoint and told him if he came back the conversation would be shorter. Martha had no appointment. She simply knocked. The man who opened the door was not what she expected, though she was not entirely certain what she had expected. He was tall. He filled the doorframe without quite seeming to notice it. He looked at her the way people in the frontier look at unexpected visitors, with a wariness that is not unfriendly but makes no assumptions about what the visit means. "Mr. Rhodes," she said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced steadiness her whole life, and she was very good at it now. "My name is Martha Wells. Elias Wells was my grandfather. I need to speak with you about the Sweetwater Valley Land Registry, and I would be grateful for 20 minutes of your time." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. The interior of the ranch house was not what she had expected either. It was clean. There were books on a shelf near the fireplace, real books, not just almanacs and farm records, though there were those too. There was a good cast iron stove and a pine table with 4 chairs and a window facing west that had clearly been positioned deliberately to catch the afternoon light. It was the house of a man who lived alone but who had decided, somewhere along the way, to live alone with some care and intention. She sat down at the table. He sat across from her and he folded his hands and he waited for her to speak. He did not try to fill the silence. She noticed that. It was unusual. She told him everything. She told him about her grandfather's homestead claim filed in 1868 under the Homestead Act. She told him about the 5 years of improvements Elias Wells had made, the house and the barn and the irrigation channel and the fences, all the evidence of continuous occupation that the law required. She told him about how Elias had received his final patent in 1873 and how she had come to live with him that same year, after her own parents died of typhoid fever in Nebraska, and how she had worked the land beside him for 2 years before his heart gave out in April. She told him about the letters that had started arriving in May, from a land attorney named Prescott representing an investor named Dalton Briggs, suggesting that certain questions had arisen regarding the validity of the original filing. She told him about the counterclaim that had appeared in the county records in June, bearing what looked like official signatures but which she had never seen before. About how the commission had scheduled a hearing that kept getting pushed to later dates, and how the county clerk, a man named Tanner who had been friendly to her grandfather for years, had suddenly become unavailable whenever she came to the office. About how one of her fence lines had been cut 3 times in August and her chickens had been stolen twice, and both times when she went to report it to the deputy had a great deal of difficulty finding time to ride out and take a look. Wallace Rhodes listened to all of it without interrupting. His expression did not change in any dramatic way, but she noticed something shifting behind his eyes. A kind of recognition, maybe. Or a kind of anger that was too controlled to show on the surface yet. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Briggs." "You know him," she said. "I know what he does," Wallace said. "He finds properties where the original owners are elderly, or dead, or both. He gets someone inside the county office to muddy the registration records. Then he sends his attorney to the hearing with a forged counter-document, and 3 men who were probably paid last month's wages to say whatever Prescott tells them to say. He's done it 4 times that I know of in this territory. Two of the homesteaders took the buyout money because they couldn't fight it. One family left in the middle of the night because they were afraid. The fourth man tried to fight it in court, and Prescott buried him in delay after delay until the man went broke paying legal fees and sold at a loss anyway. Martha looked at him steadily. "I will not leave my grandfather's land," she said. "Not for money, not for pressure, not for anything." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in her stillness that caught him off guard, and Wallace Rhodes was a man who prided himself on not being caught off guard. It was not stubbornness exactly, though there was stubbornness in it. It was something cleaner than that. It was the kind of conviction that comes from a person who has already weighed every possible outcome, including the bad ones, and decided that some things matter more than safety. "Do you have your grandfather's original filing documents?" he asked. "I have copies," she said. "The originals would be at the General Land Office in Cheyenne." "Then that's where we start," he said. She blinked. "We." He looked across the table at her, and something passed between them in that moment that was not yet named but was already real, the way a storm is real before you can see it, before you can feel the change in the air. "I have business in Cheyenne," he said, which was not quite the full truth, and they both knew it, though neither of them said so. "I can make the inquiry while I'm there." She wanted to ask him why. She wanted to know what his hidden motive was, because in her experience, people did not offer help like this without something underneath it. But she looked at his face, and what she found there was not calculation. It was something simpler and in some ways more unsettling. It looked like someone who had just decided something. "I can pay you," she said. "Not now, but when I sell the hay." "You don't need to pay me," he said. "I'm not taking charity," she said. "It's not charity," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather was a good man. He helped me when I first came here. I had a problem with a water rights dispute in my first year, and he testified for me at the county level without me asking him to. He just showed up, said it was the right thing to do." He paused. "I never properly settled that debt." Martha was quiet for a moment. "He never mentioned that," she said softly. "He wouldn't," Wallace said. "That's who he was." They sat with that for a moment, the two of them, and the memory of a good man between them like something held carefully in both hands. Then she stood up and extended her hand across the table, and he shook it. His hand was very large and very warm, and she was aware of it in a way she did not particularly examine right then. "Thank you, Mr. Rhodes," she said. "Wallace," he said. She hesitated for just a beat. "Wallace," she said. She walked back the 3 miles to her homestead in the cold autumn wind, and she did not allow herself to think too carefully about the fact that she felt, for the first time in 7 months, like she was not entirely alone in this fight. Thinking carefully about it seemed dangerous somehow, like looking directly at something you want so badly that wanting it itself becomes a kind of vulnerability. She had enough vulnerabilities already. She did not need more. Wallace Rhodes left for Cheyenne 3 days later. He told his ranch foreman, a steady and capable man named Burl Cates, to keep an eye on the Wells property while he was gone, which was a thing he said casually and without explanation, though Burl had known Wallace long enough to understand that when the boss gave an instruction that casually, it meant the opposite of casual. Cheyenne in November 1875 was the territorial capital and a busy, ambitious city of 12,000 people, full of cattle money and railroad money and land money, and the particular energetic corruption that attaches itself to places where all 3 kinds of money are moving fast in the same direction. Wallace had been there a dozen times on cattle business, and he knew his way around the operational territory of the place, meaning he knew which offices held the real power, and which men inside those offices could be trusted, and which ones required something more than trust. The General Land Office was on Ferguson Street. The federal registrar was a man named Arthur Kimball, who had held the position for 6 years and who was, as far as Wallace could determine from his own dealings, and from things he had heard over those years, one of the few genuinely honest officials in the territorial government. He had gray side whiskers and a methodical manner, and an expression of perpetual mild exasperation with the amount of paperwork the frontier generated. Wallace explained what he was looking for. Kimball listened carefully, and then disappeared into the filing room for 35 minutes and came back with a large folio of land records and began working through them with deliberate care. What he found was that the original filing documents for the Wells homestead claim were present, complete, and entirely in order. The 1868 registration was there. The improvement documentation was there. The 1873 final patent confirmation was there. Every signature was verified, every date was correct, every legal requirement had been met. "The claim is valid," Kimball said, in a tone that suggested he could not understand why this was in question. "Someone has introduced a counterfiling into the county records in Laramie," Wallace said. Kimball's mild exasperation sharpened into something less mild. "Then someone has introduced a fraudulent counterfiling," he said. "Because everything in this office says Elias Wells held a clear and legal patent on that property from 1873 forward. Can I have a certified copy of the original filing documents?" Wallace asked. Kimball looked at him over his reading spectacles for a moment. "Are you a party to the land claim?" he asked. "I'm a witness and an interested party," Wallace said. "The heir to the claim is Martha Wells, granddaughter of Elias Wells. She's 26 years old and she has been living on and working that property for 2 years. The hearing is scheduled for March." Kimball considered this for a moment. Then he said, "I will prepare a certified copy of every relevant document, and I will also prepare a sworn statement from this office regarding the validity of the original filing." He paused. "I will also write a personal letter to Commissioner Holt in Laramie informing him that this office is aware of the proceeding and is watching it with interest." Wallace looked at him. "That last part is not required." "No," Kimball agreed pleasantly, "but it might be useful." He paused again. "I have seen 3 of Dalton Briggs's acquisitions pass through this office as attempted record modifications in the last 4 years. All 3 were rejected at the federal level, but by then the original owners had already given up. I do not find that outcome acceptable." Wallace rode back from Cheyenne with a sealed oilskin package of certified documents in his vest pocket. He rode 5 days in cold weather, and he spent a good deal of those 5 days thinking about Martha Wells. He thought about the steadiness of her, the way she had sat across his table and told him about losing her parents and then her grandfather, and about 7 months of pressure and harassment and obstruction, and the way she had told it without any performance of suffering, just the plain facts laid out in the correct order, because she was the kind of person who dealt in facts and precise language and did not dress her pain up for other people's consumption. He thought about the line of her jaw and the way she had extended her hand across the table like a businesswoman making a deal. He thought about the way she had said his name, Wallace, like she was testing the weight of it. He was not a man who let himself feel things easily or quickly. The frontier had not made him this way. He had arrived this way, carrying the history of a life that had asked too much of him too fast, and had taught him early that feeling things quickly was a fast route to catastrophic mistakes. He had been married once briefly in 1868 to a woman named Clara who had come west with him from Ohio and had discovered within 8 months that she hated the territory and everything in it, and had gone back east on the train in February of 1869 and written him a letter from Cincinnati explaining that she wished him well and hoped he understood. He had understood. He had not blamed her. He had simply understood that some things break under the pressure of distance and hardship, and that understanding this was not the same as not feeling it. He had not allowed himself to feel much since then. He had put everything into the land and the cattle and the work, and for 6 years it had been enough, and he had told himself it was enough, and mostly he had believed himself. But something was shifting now, and he was not sure what to do about it. He arrived back at his ranch on a Sunday evening, cold and stiff, and he unsaddled his horse himself and rubbed the animal down, and made sure it was fed and watered before he went inside. Then he built a fire and stood at the window in the firelight looking north in the direction of the Wells homestead, 3 miles away, with the oilskin package sitting on the table behind him. He made himself wait until morning before he went. It seemed important to wait, though he could not have said exactly why. Martha was in the barn when he arrived, mending a harness with the careful, efficient movements of someone who had done it many times and who had learned to be precise, because every piece of equipment mattered and replacements were expensive. She heard him ride up and came to the barn door and looked at him, and the expression on her face was something he would think about for a long time afterward. It was not relief exactly, though there was relief in it. It was more like recognition, like she had been holding her breath for 5 days without quite acknowledging it and had only just been allowed to stop. She looked at the package in his hand. "You found them," she said. "Everything's there," he said. Original filing, improvement records, final patent, certified copies, federal seal, and a sworn statement from the registrar himself. He paused. "He's also written to the commission." She stood very still for a moment. Then she set down the harness and walked toward him, and he stepped down from his horse and handed her the package, and she took it and held it against her chest with both arms the way you hold something you cannot believe is real yet. "How much do I owe you?" she said. Her voice was carefully neutral. "For riding to Cheyenne and back," he said. "For your time," she said. "For the days you spent away from your operation." He looked at her. Something in him wanted to say something other than what he actually said, which was, "Nothing. I told you." She lifted her chin slightly. He had already noticed that she did this when she was managing an emotion she did not want to show. She had done it at the table in his house when she talked about her grandfather. She did it now, and it made something in his chest contract in a way that was not at all convenient. "Then stay for supper," she said. It came out more like a business proposition than an invitation, which made it easier somehow for both of them. He stayed for supper. And then he stayed for 3 more suppers that week, and the week after that. And by the end of November, it had become a pattern that neither of them had formally agreed to, but that both of them arranged their days around. He would ride over in the evenings, 2 or 3 times a week, and she would cook and they would sit at her grandfather's table and they would talk. They talked about the land claim preparation. They talked about the legal strategy for the hearing, which was now confirmed for March 15th. They talked about the documents and what each one proved, and what the commission's attorney would likely argue, and how they would respond to each argument. This was the outer layer of the conversation, the useful and practical surface of it. Beneath that, they talked about everything else. She told him about growing up in Nebraska, about her parents, about the particular loneliness of being an only child in a household that was struggling and serious, and not cruel but not warm either. About coming to Wyoming at 23 to live with her grandfather, who had surprised her by being someone she actually liked, not just loved, which she had not expected. About learning to love the land in a way she had not expected, which was not a romantic feeling but something more physical and specific, the understanding of water and soil and weather, and the way the valley changed from season to season. He told her about Ohio, about the farm that had been his father's and his grandfather's that had been sold to pay debts after his father died when Wallace was 19. About working cattle drives for 4 years to save enough money to come west and start his own operation. About the 3 years it had taken to make the Rhodes ranch into something that wasn't simply surviving but actually working. About Clara, which he mentioned only briefly and without drama, as a fact of his history, as something that had happened and mattered but did not define him, though she understood from the brevity with which he mentioned it that it had shaped him in ways he did not fully catalog. She did not press him on it. She had her own things she held carefully, and she respected when other people held theirs. The evenings had a texture to them that they both felt and neither named. There was the fire and the lamplight and the sound of the wind outside, which was frequently considerable. There was the pine table between them covered in documents and coffee cups. There was the quality of attention they paid to each other, the way each of them noticed what the other said and thought about it before responding, the absence of the kind of casual inattention that people use to manage the discomfort of real closeness. One evening in December, she reached across the table to take a document he was pointing to, and their hands met, and neither of them moved for a moment. Not a dramatic moment. Just a pause, a single beat of held stillness, his large, rough hand and her capable one, the lamp burning between them, the wind doing its work outside. Then he passed her the document and she looked at it and said something sensible about the notarization date, and they continued working. But something had shifted and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. In January, the threats escalated. Dalton Briggs had apparently received information that the Federal Land Office documents had been secured because the pressure changed character. The fence cutting and chicken stealing gave way to something more direct. A man she had never seen before came to her door on a Wednesday morning and told her, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, that Mr. Briggs was prepared to offer her $500 for the property, and that it would be wise of her to take it and move on, because the hearing was a formality and the outcome was predetermined. He said the word predetermined with the kind of satisfaction of a man who likes delivering bad news. She told him to get off her property. He smiled again and left, and she went inside and stood in her kitchen for 5 minutes with her hands very flat on the table and her breathing deliberate before she walked to the barn and saddled the lame horse, who was healed now, and rode to Wallace's ranch. She had not done this before. She had always waited for him to come to her, had always let the evenings happen on his initiative because it seemed safer that way, because she had been very clear with herself that she was not going to lean on this man the way you lean on someone when you have let yourself want more than you have allowed yourself to want. But something about being looked at by a man with that particular dead-eyed smile, and told that her grandfather's legal rights were a formality, and the outcome was predetermined, made the careful management of her feelings seem less important than it had yesterday. Wallace was in the yard when she rode up, working with 2 of his ranch hands on a fence repair. He looked up and saw her face and said 2 words to Burl Cates and walked toward her. She told him about the man at her door. She told it plainly and without embellishment, but he could hear something underneath the plain telling, could hear the thing she was managing, and he recognized it because he had spent the past 3 months managing his own version of the same thing. When she finished, he said, "That man's name is Cord Dupree. He works directly for Briggs as a pressure agent. He's not a gunman, but he works with gunmen." He paused. "You should not be staying alone at that property right now." She looked at him steadily. "I am not leaving my grandfather's home," she said. "We have already established this." "I know," he said. He was quiet for a moment, working something through. "Then I will stay there." She blinked. "I beg your pardon. It's inappropriate on its own," he said in the tone of a man addressing a logistical problem. "Burl Cates has a wife. She can stay at the property with you. I'll sleep in your barn, which your grandfather built to sleep 2 horses and has room for a cot. Nobody will come on that property at night if they know I'm there." "That is very presumptuous," she said. "Yes," he agreed. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind lifted a strand of hair across her cheek, and she pushed it back with one gloved hand. He was watching her with that steady, direct attention that she had noticed from the first day, and that she had spent 3 months trying to think about less than she actually thought about it. "All right," she said. This arrangement lasted for 6 weeks. Margaret Cates, Burl's wife, was a solid and practical woman of 40 who had 3 grown children and no particular interest in social performance, which Martha found deeply restful. They developed a workable domestic rhythm quickly, the 3 of them in the Wells house and Wallace in the barn, and the days had a fullness to them that Martha had not felt in a long time. There was company. There was the particular warmth of people moving around a house together, overlapping schedules and shared meals, and the small negotiations of shared space. Wallace and Martha worked together every morning on the hearing preparation. They organized the documents into a coherent sequence. They worked through the arguments the commission's attorney was likely to make, which Wallace had obtained through a careful conversation with a friendly lawyer in Laramie named Hale Drummond, who knew the commission's procedures well and had no love for Dalton Briggs. They prepared Martha's testimony and they rehearsed it, which Martha found difficult not because she was afraid of speaking in front of people, but because rehearsing required her to say certain things about her grandfather, about his care for the land and his understanding of his rights and his decades of labor on it. And every time she said these things, the grief caught her in a slightly different place. Wallace watched her work through this with a care that he did not disguise in these weeks the way he had been disguising things before. He noticed every time she stopped in the middle of a sentence and regrouped. He noticed when she was tired. He brought her coffee at 10 o'clock every morning and set it beside her without comment, and went back to whatever he was doing, because he had understood something about her, which was that she did not like to be watched when she was struggling, but she did like to be seen when she had pulled herself back together. One morning in February, she was sitting at the table with her grandfather's original land survey maps spread out in front of her, and she was not crying exactly, but her eyes were full, and she was not blinking, and she was holding herself very still. And he came in from outside and stopped when he saw her and understood what he was looking at. He sat down across from her. He did not say anything. After a long moment she said, "He surveyed every inch of this land himself in 1867 before he filed. He was 51 years old and he walked every boundary with a compass and a notebook. It took him 3 weeks." "I know," Wallace said quietly. "He showed me the maps once. He was proud of them." She looked up at him then. "He liked you," she said. "He mentioned you a few times over the years. He said you were a fair man and a hard worker and that you had too much integrity for your own practical good." She paused. "He meant it as a compliment." Wallace looked at her across the table with the maps of Elias Wells's careful labor spread between them, and something broke open in him that had been closed for a long time. Not dramatically, not with any gesture or announcement, just a quiet internal recognition that this woman and this place and this fight and these morning coffees and these evenings by the fire had become something he could not imagine removing from his life. He did not say this. It was too early and the situation was too precarious and there was too much unresolved between them and around them. He simply said, he was right on all 3 counts, and let her decide what to do with that. She looked at him for a beat longer than necessary. Then she looked back at the maps, but the corner of her mouth had moved in a way that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to one to do something to his chest. March arrived cold and sharp. The hearing was in 12 days. Dalton Briggs made one more attempt. He sent Cord Dupree to Wallace's ranch this time, not Martha's. Dupree rode up on a Thursday morning while Wallace was in the yard and offered him, with the same dead-eyed pleasantness he brought to everything, a proposition. If Wallace Rhodes withdrew his support for the Wells claim and ceased any involvement with the hearing, Briggs was prepared to sell Wallace the 200 acres adjacent to the Rhodes ranch's northern boundary at a price 20% below market value. A mutually beneficial arrangement, Dupree said. "Business," he said. "No hard feelings," he said. Wallace looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, with perfect calm, "Tell Briggs he can keep his 200 acres and his dead-eyed messenger and his predetermined outcomes and every other thing he owns. Tell him if he sends anyone to the Wells property again, before the hearing I will report the fence cutting and the property theft and the intimidation visits to the territorial marshal's office, and I will do it personally and in writing, and I will follow up until someone actually does something about it. And tell him that on March 15th, we will see each other in that hearing room." Dupree left without his smile this time. Wallace went inside and told Martha what had happened. He told her all of it, including the offer, which he did not soften or reframe. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He thought you would take it." Yes, Wallace said. Why didn't you? She said. And there was something in how she asked it, not suspicious, not testing, but genuinely wanting to know the real answer underneath the simple one. He looked at her across the kitchen where she was standing with a dish towel in her hands and the morning light coming through the window behind her, and he said, "Because there are some things worth more than 200 acres." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she folded the dish towel very carefully and set it on the counter and said, "I think you should know that I am not an uncomplicated person to be in proximity to." He almost smiled. "I had noticed," he said. "I am stubborn," she said, "and private. And I find it very difficult to ask for help even when I obviously need it. And I have a great deal of unresolved grief that comes out sideways sometimes. And I am probably, objectively, too attached to a piece of land." "That last one is not a flaw," he said. She looked at him. "I am trying to warn you," she said, and her voice had gone quiet and careful in a way that told him she was saying something real and important under the words. He crossed the kitchen, and he stopped close enough that there was very little distance between them, and he said, "Martha, I rode 42 miles in 6 hours to get to Cheyenne and back. I have slept in your barn for 6 weeks. I have organized land records in my sleep. I think the warning has already been delivered and received, and I am still here." She looked up at him, and the expression on her face was the most unguarded he had ever seen it, all the careful steadiness suspended for just a moment, showing him something underneath that was soft and bright and afraid and wanting. He kissed her, carefully, like it was a question. She kissed him back, like it was an answer. Afterward she pressed her forehead against his chest for just a moment, and he held her, and the kitchen was very quiet, and the light moved through the window, and nothing dramatic happened. And it was, he thought, one of the most important moments of his life. They pulled apart because Margaret Cates came in the back door carrying a basket of eggs and stopped in the doorway and looked at them both and said, without any particular surprise, "Oh, good. I was wondering when you two were going to stop being ridiculous," and went to the stove. The 8 days before the hearing were the most intense of Martha's life, which was saying something. Dalton Briggs's attorney, the elegant and remorseless Prescott, filed a motion to exclude the federal registrar's certified copies on procedural grounds so narrow and technical that they seemed designed entirely to confuse. Hale Drummond, who had agreed to serve as Martha's legal counsel for the hearing, worked for 3 days straight to counter the motion. The commission denied the exclusion motion, which felt like a small victory, and which Wallace told Martha not to trust too completely, because small victories before a hearing were not infrequently ways of managing a losing party into complacency. Burl Cates had a quiet conversation with 2 other ranchers in the county, men named Ferris and Abbott, who had both dealt with Briggs's land pressure in previous years, and who had both, for different reasons, never forgiven him for it. They agreed to be present at the hearing, not as witnesses, just present, as neighbors who had an interest in how land claims were handled in Laramie County. Wallace understood that presence of this kind had its own weight. Martha prepared her testimony until she could deliver it with precision from beginning to end without any notes. She stood in her kitchen and said it to the wall, and then she said it to Wallace, and he listened and occasionally said things like, "Say that slower," or "Stop, and look directly at the commission when you say the part about the 1873 patent." And she adjusted each time without complaint, which told him something about how seriously she was taking this and how much the outcome mattered to her, as if he had needed to be told. The night before the hearing they sat at the table late, much later than usual. Margaret had gone to bed. The fire was low and the lamp was burning, and the documents were all packed in the satchel ready. There was nothing left to prepare. They were both aware of this in a specific way, the way you are aware when the doing is done and what's left is the waiting and the feeling of things. She said, "What happens if it doesn't work?" He said, "It will work," she said, "but what if it doesn't? I want to think about it clearly. I need to know I have already looked at it." He understood this about her, this need to have seen every possible outcome, including the worst one, to not be surprised by catastrophe. He thought about it honestly. "If they rule against you despite everything we've brought," he said, "then we go to the territorial court. We have the federal documents and the registrar's sworn statement. No territorial court is going to overturn a federal land office certification. It will take time and it will be difficult, but you will keep your land." She was quiet for a moment. "And if the territorial court is also compromised," she said, "then we take it to federal court," he said simply, "and I will pay the legal costs." She looked at him sharply. "Before you say something about charity or pride," he said, "listen to me. The land that the Rhodes Ranch sits on abuts the Sweetwater Valley to the east. If Dalton Briggs acquires the Wells property, he controls the water access for my entire northern range. My operation is not secure as long as your claim is contested. It is therefore entirely in my direct financial interest to ensure you keep that land." He paused. "That's the practical explanation." She looked at him for a moment. "And the non-practical explanation," she said. He held her gaze. "You know the non-practical explanation," he said. She did. She leaned forward and kissed him briefly, then sat back and looked at the fire. "We are going to win tomorrow," she said. "Not a question, a decision." "Yes," he agreed. "We are." The morning of March 15th was clear and cold. The sky an absolute uncompromising blue that you only get in Wyoming in early spring, as if the weather is making a statement. They rode to Laramie in Wallace's wagon, Martha and Wallace and Hale Drummond, who had ridden out from town the evening before and slept on the ranch house floor, and was now reviewing his notes on the buckboard seat with the focused energy of a man who genuinely enjoyed a legal fight. Martha was wearing her best dress, dark green wool that had been her mother's, and that she had altered herself 2 years ago. She had her hair pinned up under a dark hat. She was very composed. Wallace, riding beside her, was aware of the particular quality of her composure, which was not absence of feeling but total management of it. All that brightness and conviction and grief and love compressed into the precise instrument of a woman walking into a fight she refused to lose. The Laramie County Land Commission hearing room was on the second floor of the county building, a long rectangular room with high windows and a raised platform at the front where the 5 commissioners sat behind a long table. Commissioner Gerald Holt sat at the center. He was a bald, heavy-set man with the careful neutrality of expression that people adopt when they are trying not to show whose side they are on, which in Holt's case usually meant Briggs's side, because Briggs had been supporting his political interests for 9 years. Dalton Briggs himself sat at the left side of the room with his attorney Prescott and 2 other men. Briggs was 60 years old, silver-haired, prosperous in appearance, with the kind of confident stillness that rich men who have operated outside the law for a long time develop, the certainty of a man who believes the mechanisms of consequence do not apply to him because they never have yet. He looked at Martha Wells when she came in without any particular expression. He did not look at Wallace at all, which Wallace found more interesting than if he had. Prescott had brought his 3 witnesses. Martha recognized 2 of them from the previous hearing sessions. They were competent liars, meaning they had been coached well, and they believed, with good reason, that the commission was going to find in their favor regardless. Hale Drummond was a small, precise man with quick eyes and an extraordinary memory. He set up his materials at the right side table, and he said good morning to Prescott with the pleasantness of a man who intends to dismantle the other man's case and sees no reason to be unkind about it. The hearing opened. Prescott laid out Briggs's position with practiced fluency. The Wells homestead filing had procedural deficiencies. The notarization on the 1868 document was irregular. A competing claim had been filed by a third party in 1871, which Prescott's witnesses would testify to, and this claim had superior standing. Miss Wells, while entitled to sympathy as a bereaved granddaughter, did not have legal standing to the property under challenge. Martha sat very still through all of this. Wallace sat beside her, and he did not touch her because she did not need comfort right now. She needed space for the precision she was exercising, but he was close enough that she could feel his presence, and she did feel it, and it was exactly what she needed. Hale Drummond began his response. He was methodical and thorough. He laid out the documents one by one, and he walked the commission through each one. The 1868 filing, the improvement records, the 1873 patent, the Federal Registrar's certified copies, the sworn statement from Arthur Kimball of the General Land Office in Cheyenne. He was particularly precise about the sworn statement, reading it aloud in full in the kind of calm, carrying voice that makes it impossible for anyone in the room to avoid hearing every word. Prescott objected 3 times. Drummond addressed each objection with the relevant section of the applicable legal statute. The commission sustained none of Prescott's objections. Then Drummond called his first witness, which was not Martha but was Hale Drummond himself presenting, through a series of carefully organized exhibits, a detailed analysis of the counterfiling that Prescott's clients had introduced into the county records. Drummond had spent one very productive week with a handwriting expert from Denver named Collins, who had examined the signature on the alleged 1871 counterfiling, and produced a written analysis concluding that the signature bore significant characteristics inconsistent with the other documented signatures of the man it purported to belong to. The man, who had conveniently died in 1872, was therefore unable to confirm or deny whether he had ever filed such a claim. But Collins's analysis was thorough and compelling, and it made the counterfiling look, to anyone reading carefully, like exactly what it was. Prescott's 3 witnesses testified. They were confident. Drummond cross-examined them with precise, patient, entirely lethal questions about dates and locations and specific details that conflicting recollections have difficulty surviving. By the 3rd witness, 2 of Prescott's witnesses had contradicted each other on 3 specific factual points. Then Martha testified. She stood up at the front of the room, and she looked at the commission, and she spoke with absolute clarity and without notes. She talked about her grandfather. She talked about the survey maps he had made himself, each boundary walked and recorded. She talked about the house and the barn and the irrigation channel and the fences, the years of labor that constitute the homestead improvements the law requires. She talked about coming to live with him in 1873, the year the final patent was confirmed, and she talked about what she had learned from him about this land, its water and its soil and its rhythms. She talked about his death in April, and about finding the letters from Prescott in May, and about the 7 months of pressure and interference and intimidation that had followed. She spoke for 22 minutes. She did not once look away from the commissioners. She did not once raise her voice or lose her composure, but there was something in the room by the time she was finished that had not been in the room before, a quality of stillness that comes when people in a space have all together understood something true. Commissioner Holt looked deeply uncomfortable. He was looking at his papers. He was aware, quite clearly, that the room had changed around him. He was also aware of the letter from Arthur Kimball's office that had arrived 3 weeks ago, and that had been written in the particular careful language of a federal official, who is informing a local commission that the federal government is paying attention. And he was aware of Ferris and Abbott and 2 other ranchers sitting in the back of the room who had no legal standing in this proceeding, but whose presence constituted a kind of moral accounting that he would have to live with in this county long after today. Prescott rose to deliver his summary argument. He was still smooth and confident, because that was how he was built, and because he had been in hearing rooms before when things were going this way and had survived them. He argued that the certified federal documents were relevant but not dispositive. He argued that the commission had independent authority. He used the word irregular 3 more times in reference to the Wells filing. And that was when Wallace Rhodes stood up. He had not been formally called as a witness, and he had not been formally permitted to address the commission, and technically what he was doing was out of order. He knew this. Hale Drummond looked at him sideways and made the briefest possible expression of a man accepting an unexpected development. Prescott turned to look at him with the first genuine emotion he had shown all morning, which was alarm. Wallace set his palms flat on the commission table. The inkwells rattled. "Her grandfather filed that claim legally," he said. His voice was quiet and absolutely clear. "And I have the original." He reached into his vest and drew out the oilskin package, and he opened it, and he laid the original certified copy of Elias Wells's 1868 homestead filing, with Arthur Kimball's federal seal, in front of Gerald Holt. And then he said something else. He said it looking directly at Holt, not at Briggs, not at Prescott, directly at the man who had the power to decide this, in the kind of voice that is not a threat but is as close to one as honesty can get. He said, "This commission has a choice today. It can look at this document and at the Federal Registrar's sworn statement, and at 7 years of recorded improvements, and at the testimony of the woman who has lived and worked on this property, and it can make the correct legal determination. Or it can ignore all of that and make a different determination, and I want Commissioner Holt and every member of this commission to understand that the outcome of today's hearing will be in the hands of the Territorial Marshal's Office and the Federal Land Office and the Laramie County Sentinel by tomorrow morning. I will see to it personally." Holt stared at the document in front of him. The room was absolutely silent. Prescott said, "I object to this entirely irregular procedure and I demand that this witness be removed." "Sit down, Mr. Prescott," said Commissioner Holt. Prescott sat down. Holt picked up the document. He read it. He passed it to the commissioner on his right, who read it and passed it to the commissioner on his left, and so on down the table. Nobody spoke while this happened. Then Holt set it down and looked at the room and said, "This commission will take a 30-minute recess to review the presented evidence." 32 minutes later, they came back in. Holt said, "The commission finds that the original homestead claim filed by Elias Wells in 1868 is legally valid and properly recorded. The final patent of 1873 is upheld. The counterfiling submitted by the opposing party is found to contain significant questions of authenticity that cannot be resolved in favor of the claimant. The Wells property claim is confirmed. The property is the legal possession of Martha Wells as sole heir of Elias Wells." He paused and then said something that he did not have to say, and that probably cost him something in some way that Wallace would think about later. This commission also notes that it is referring the question of the counterfiling's authenticity to the Territorial Marshal's Office for further investigation. Briggs left the room without speaking. Prescott gathered his papers with the controlled efficiency of a man who had lost before and knew how to handle it, and left. The 3 witnesses left. Cord Dupree, who had been sitting in the back corner, left. Martha sat in her chair for a moment after the room began to clear. She had not moved since Holt finished speaking. Drummond was gathering the documents and shaking hands with people, and doing all the things you do when a proceeding ends. Ferris and Abbott came forward and spoke briefly to Wallace. Margaret Cates, who had come in quietly halfway through and sat in the back, came to the front now. Then Martha stood up. She picked up the satchel with her grandfather's survey maps in it, and she turned and she looked at Wallace Rhodes. He was looking at her. He looked as he always looked, steady and direct and without any performance in it. But his eyes were doing the thing they did when he was feeling something he wasn't performing, that quality of absolute, undisguised attention. She crossed the room to him and she said in a low voice that the remaining people in the room might or might not have heard, "You were entirely out of order." "I know," he said. "Drummond could have handled it," she said. "He was handling it very well," Wallace agreed. "Then why?" she said. He looked at her. "Because," he said, "some things need to be said by the person who means them the most." She looked at him for a moment. Then she took one step forward and she put both hands against his chest, and she pressed her forehead against him the way she had done that morning in the kitchen, and he put his arms around her and held her, there in the hearing room with the last of the spectators filing out, in the clear March light coming through the high windows. She was not crying. She was breathing. Just breathing, slowly and steadily, with her hands against his chest and his arms around her, taking in the fact that it was over, that the land was safe, that her grandfather's years of careful legal work had held, that she had not had to leave. He held her and he thought, without any particular drama, that he would like to hold her for the rest of his life. He did not say this yet. He waited until they were back at the Wells property that evening, just the two of them, Margaret having returned to the Cates ranch because the professional crisis was resolved. They were sitting at the table again, the familiar table, with the survey map spread out between them and the fire burning and the lamps lit, and it was, he thought, the most natural and comfortable thing he had ever known, this particular table and these maps and this woman. He said, "I have a question." She looked up from the map she was studying. The way she looked at him had been different since the hearing room, not dramatically different, just slightly more open, like a door that had been properly bolted for a long time and had now been merely pulled to. "All right," she said. He said, "I would like very much to ask permission to come courting, formally, with your full understanding of what I mean by it." She was quiet for a moment. "You have been sleeping in my barn for 6 weeks," she said. "That was protective," he said. "This is different." She looked at him and the corner of her mouth moved. "How different?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, organizing his words because he wanted to say this correctly. He said, "I intend, if you will allow it, to be present in your life in a consistent and deliberate way, with the eventual intention of asking you to marry me when the time is appropriate and when you are ready and not before." He paused. "I am not in a hurry. I am not making demands. I simply want to know that we are moving in the same direction." She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that he almost started to think he had read things wrong, which would have been one of the significant errors of his life. Then she said, "You can come courting, Wallace Rhodes." She said it with that careful precision she brought to important things. "And you can stop sleeping in the barn." He looked at her. She colored slightly, which was so unusual for her that it was charming in a way that she would probably have found mortifying if she had known. "I mean you can stay in the house," she clarified with tremendous dignity. "There is a second bedroom. It is more practical." "It is," he agreed solemnly, and she looked at him and understood that he found this charming, and she attempted to look stern about it and did not entirely succeed. Spring came. The Sweetwater Valley thawed, and the irrigation channel that Elia's Wells had built filled with snowmelt from the high country, and the pastures greened, and Martha worked her land with the particular joy of a person who has been told it will be taken from them, and then told it will not, and who is therefore never again going to take a single morning of it for granted. Wallace was there most days. He had his own operation to run, and he ran it. But the Rhodes Ranch and the Wells homestead were 3 miles apart, and 3 miles is a short ride when the motivation is sufficient. He helped her repair the south fence line, which had been cut 3 times and needed more than field mending. He helped her plan the spring planting. He brought books over from his shelf and left them on her table, not as grand gestures, but as the kind of ordinary thoughtfulness that turns into something essential when it becomes consistent. She came to his ranch and helped with the spring branding, which she had learned from her grandfather, and which she did with quiet competence that impressed his ranch hands considerably, and that she accepted their respect for without either false modesty or performance. They rode out together on Sunday afternoon sometimes, into the high country above the valley where the land was still wild, and the sky came down to the ridgelines, and you could see for 50 miles in any direction. These rides were mostly quiet. They were both people who understood that silence shared comfortably is a deeper kind of intimacy than most conversation, and they had reached that kind of silence with each other, and they valued it. One Sunday in May, sitting on a flat rock above the valley with the horses cropping grass behind them and the whole long afternoon laid out before them, he asked her, He did not make a speech. He took a small box from his coat pocket and he held it out to her and he said, "I told you I would ask when the time was right. I think it is right." She looked at the box. Inside was a small gold ring with a garnet dark red that had belonged to his mother in Ohio and that he had carried west in 1869 and had kept in a box in his bureau drawer for 6 years. She had not known this. He had not told her yet, but he did now, briefly, simply, the way he told important things. She looked at the ring and then at him. "You have been carrying your mother's ring for 6 years," she said. "I didn't know who it was for yet," he said. She looked at the valley below them, the green and gold of her grandfather's pastures, the line of the irrigation channel, the barn roof, the house. She looked at it for a long moment and then she looked at him and she said, "Yes." He put the ring on her finger. She turned her hand over and looked at it in the afternoon light. Then she leaned over and kissed him, unhurried, with the particular quality of a kiss that has all the time in the world because the future is settled, and the present is exactly sufficient. "I should tell you," she said afterward, "that I intend to keep the property in the name Wallace Rhodes, both names." He thought about this for a moment. "The hyphen is acceptable," he said. "It is not negotiable," she said. "I know," he said, and he was smiling now, which was still something she found startling and wonderful because he did it rarely enough that it never became ordinary. "I said it was acceptable." They were married in June of 1876 in the front yard of the Wells property, which was already being called the Wallace Rhodes homestead by the county register, because Martha had filed the name amendment the week after the engagement with the same brisk efficiency she brought to all legal matters. The minister came from Laramie. Burl and Margaret Cates were there, and Hale Drummond, and Ferris and Abbott and their families, and a dozen other people from across the valley who had watched this particular story unfold over the winter and spring, and who came partly to celebrate and partly, Wallace suspected, because the story had given people who lived hard practical frontier lives something they needed, which was evidence that certain things could be fought for and won. Elias Wells's survey maps were framed and hung on the wall of the parlor. The summer was busy and full. They combined the operations in practical ways, the livestock management and the water rights and the north and east range, creating something that was more efficient and more resilient than either homestead had been separately. They hired 2 additional hands and built a new cattle pen. The Rhodes Ranch house, which was slightly larger, became the primary residence, though they spent days and sometimes weeks at the Wells homestead when the work required it, and Martha was particular about keeping the house properly maintained and the land worked, because it was her grandfather's, and because she had fought for it, and because some things you keep as a matter of principle. Arthur Kimball's letter had had its intended effect. The Territorial Marshal's office had opened an investigation into the fraudulent counterfiling, and by August had identified the county clerk Tanner as having accepted payment from Briggs's operation to alter the records. Tanner resigned and cooperated with the investigation rather than face prosecution. Prescott's legal license in Wyoming Territory was suspended pending a separate inquiry into document fraud. Dalton Briggs himself left the territory in September, which Wallace considered appropriate, and took his operation south into Colorado, where presumably he would find other properties with elderly owners and compromised county offices, though the territorial marshal had seen to it that Colorado authorities were also informed. None of this undid the damage Briggs had done to other homesteaders before Martha. 2 families who had sold under pressure would not be getting their land back. This was a fact that Martha held with something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, the particular heaviness of knowing that justice came late and partial, and did not reach everyone who deserved it. She wrote a letter to both families and said so directly, and said she was sorry, and that she thought they had been wronged. She did not know if it helped, but she sent it. In September, Wallace came in from the North Range in the late afternoon to find Martha sitting at the kitchen table not working, which was unusual enough that he stopped in the doorway and looked at her. She was looking at nothing in particular with an expression he had not seen on her face before. It was not unhappy. It was something else, something interior and considering. "What?" he said. She looked up at him and she said in her direct way, "I believe I am expecting a child." He stood in the doorway for a moment. He was not a man who showed things dramatically, but something moved across his face that she had never seen there before either, something wide open and a little overwhelmed and very bright. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her hands in both of his, and he looked at her with that unguarded attention that she had come to understand over the year of knowing him was the most honest and complete expression of everything he felt and could not yet say. "Are you certain?" he said. "Reasonably," she said. "I will ride to see Dr. Havers in Laramie next week." He held her hands. She could feel him working through a feeling, processing something large. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "I am actually, and I am aware this is perhaps premature, extremely pleased about it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "So am I." He brought her hands up and pressed them against his chest, the way she had pressed hers to him in the hearing room, and she understood what he was doing, mirroring her, returning the gesture back to her as a kind of language, and she felt the deep and specific warmth of being fully known by another person. Dr. Havers confirmed the pregnancy in October. The baby was expected in April. Martha continued working the property through the winter, with modifications to the heavier labor that she and Wallace negotiated with some discussion, she being of the opinion that she was perfectly capable of doing everything she had always done, and he being of the opinion that certain things could be delegated to the ranch hands without any sacrifice of dignity. And they reached a compromise that was more or less satisfactory to both of them, which was their general method. The winter of 1876 to 1877 was hard. Wyoming winters frequently are. There were weeks of deep cold that tested the livestock and required constant management, and there was a fence-down emergency in January during a storm that had Wallace and Burl, and the hands out in the dark repairing it by lantern light. Martha brought the lanterns and the coffee and the extra rope and worked alongside them until Wallace looked at her in the lantern light, and she looked back at him, and something in their mutual gaze acknowledged that perhaps sitting this one out was not unreasonable, and she went inside and he was grateful and did not say too much about it. In the evenings, they read to each other. He had accumulated a considerable library over the years, Walter Scott and Dickens, and a good deal of natural history and land surveying texts, and a battered copy of Shakespeare's collected works that he had carried from Ohio. She read well and he listened, and sometimes he read and she listened, and the fire burned and the night pressed cold against the windows, and inside it was warm and full of light. In March, with the baby due within weeks, a letter arrived from Hale Drummond. He had been contacted by one of the families that Briggs had displaced, the Farrow family from the Eastern Valley, who were considering an attempt to recover their original homestead now that the investigation had revealed the fraud. Drummond wanted to know if Martha and Wallace would be willing to provide testimony. Martha wrote back the same day. Yes, absolutely, whatever was needed. She would not let the partial victory of her own case be the ceiling of what was possible. Wallace read her letter over her shoulder and then said, "I will testify also." "I know," she said. She had not needed to ask. Their son was born on April 9, 1877, in the bedroom of the Wallace Rhodes house, attended by Dr. Havers and by Margaret Cates, while Wallace sat in the kitchen with his hands clasped on the table and Burl Cates sat with him, and they did not talk much, but the company was good. The baby was healthy and loud. Wallace held him for the first time with the careful deliberateness of a man who is aware that he is holding something more important than anything he has held before, and he looked down at this small, red, furious, astonishing person, and the feeling that came over him was so large that it took him a moment to locate words for it. He looked at Martha, who was watching him from the bed with the most exhausted and radiant expression he had ever seen on anyone's face. "He looks like your grandfather," she said. "Around the eyes." Wallace looked down at the baby again. He could see it actually, something in the shape of the forehead. He felt the weight of a continuity that moved through generations, from Elia's wells to this bedroom to this small face, something that had almost been broken and had not been. "What will we name him?" he said. She had already thought about this. "Elias," she said. "Elias Rhodes." He looked at her. His jaw moved once quickly with something he was managing. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly right." Elias Rhodes was a cheerful and energetic child who found the workings of the ranch and the homestead absolutely fascinating from the moment he was old enough to follow his parents around, which was early. He had his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's stubborn precision, and a laugh that could be heard from the north pasture, which Wallace considered a personal achievement every time he heard it. The Farrow family's recovery case went forward in the fall of 1877, and Martha and Wallace both testified. The territorial court upheld the original Farrow homestead claim on the basis of the fraud evidence. It was not every family that Briggs had wronged, but it was one more, and it mattered. In the spring of 1878, Martha found herself expecting again. This time she told Wallace on the same day she suspected it, sitting at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning with Elias in his highchair, enthusiastically destroying a piece of cornbread. "I think there will be another one," she said. Wallace looked at her across the table. His expression was exactly the same as it had been the first time, that wide-open brightness that he could not control and did not attempt to. "Good," he said. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara Elaine Rhodes, was born in November 1878. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's even temperament, and she arrived with considerably less drama than Elias had, which Martha considered a personal favor. The ranch prospered. They expanded the cattle operation carefully and deliberately, adding acreage when it made sense and not when it did not. Wallace had an instinct for land and water that was partly knowledge and partly something older and more intuitive. And Martha had an instinct for records and legal standing and the future security of what they built. And together these things made them very good at building something durable. Arthur Kimball retired from the General Land Office in 1879 and wrote them a personal letter on the occasion, which Martha kept in the same satchel as her grandfather's documents. She wrote back with genuine warmth and gratitude. Hale Drummond came to dinner every few months, and he and Wallace played chess and argued about territorial politics with the comfortable heat of men who fundamentally agree about things, but enjoy disagreeing about the particulars. Margaret and Burl Cates were fixtures in their lives in the way that the best people in your life become. Not dramatic presences, but reliable ones. The people who show up when there is work and when there is trouble and when there is celebration, without being asked. On a September evening in 1880, Wallace and Martha sat on the porch of the Wells homestead, which they had ridden out to check on, and which they often used on Sunday evenings in the fall because the porch faced west and the sunsets over the Sweetwater Valley were extraordinary. Elias was 3 and asleep inside, having surrendered to exhaustion after a day of following his father across both properties. Clara was in Martha's arms, small and serious, and looking at the sunset with the focused attention of someone conducting an assessment. The light was the color of embers, gold and deep red, lying across the pastures and the irrigation channel, and the survey lines that Elias Wells had walked himself with a compass in 1867. Wallace had his arm around Martha, and she was leaning against him in the way they had settled into over 4 years of marriage, not performing closeness but simply occupying it, comfortable in it the way you are comfortable in something that fits correctly. She said, "He would have liked this." He knew she meant her grandfather. "Yes," he said, "he would have." She was quiet for a moment. "When I walked to your door that first morning," she said, "I did not expect any of this." He looked at her sideways. "What did you expect?" She considered this honestly. "I expected to find someone with leverage I could use," she said. A man with local standing who had his own reasons to oppose Briggs and who might therefore be willing to help with one specific task. She paused. I did not expect to find someone I wanted to know. He was quiet for a moment. When you knocked on that door, he said, I knew within the first 10 minutes that something was different. I don't know what I expected either. I had stopped expecting things in general by then. She turned to look at him. What made you decide, she asked, not to help with the legal work? I understand the legal work, but when did you decide about the rest of it? He thought about it. He said, there was a moment in December. You were looking at the survey maps and your eyes were full and you were holding absolutely still, and I came in and I sat down across from you and I looked at you and I understood something. What did you understand? She said. He said that whatever happened to you, I wanted to have been there for it. She looked at him for a long moment in the ember-colored light with their daughter in her arms and her grandfather's land spreading out before them, saved and certain and growing into its future. And she said, so did I, Wallace. So did I. Clara made a small decisive sound and reached one hand toward the light, opening and closing her fingers at the sunset the way small children do, as if they believe they might be able to hold it. Wallace caught her hand gently in one large finger and let her hold it, and Martha leaned her head against his shoulder, and the Sweetwater Valley held the last of the light as long as it could before the dusk came in over the ridgelines, gentle and complete. The land was theirs, the fight was over. The future was long and wide and full of ordinary days that were, for anyone paying attention, extraordinary, and they paid attention, both of them. They always would.